and urgently. One is a happy one is sort of a sad one. On one of LBJ's later visits to Independence, one of the 16, Bill was not there. I was told this by another LBJ aide, and this is one of those stories that in Bill's home state they refer to as a story that has the added advantage of being true. And what happened was, Bill can tell me if I'm wrong, LBJ occasionally ran late once in a while, and he was running late coming to Independence, so came into the house to see President Truman, said, "Mr. President, I'm sorry to be late." And Truman said, "Lyndon, if you'd wanted to be here on time, you would have been here on time." And it sounds like both of them to me. I often think of that when I'm going somewhere late, which never happens. The other story is when President Truman died the day after Christmas 1972, President Johnson wanted to go to pay his respects at the library where President Truman's casket was lying in state. And at that point, LBJ had advanced cardiovascular disease. He knew that he did not have long. He hated funerals. We were talking about this before, was affected by them. And Lady Bird did not want him to go because he was not in good physical shape to travel, and she knew that LBJ had such a connection to Harry Truman that this would affect him emotionally. He insisted on doing it because he thought not only admired Harry Truman, but thought of him as someone who was largely without honor in his own time, largely because of an unpopular war. You could see the beginning of why he felt his experience was so similar to President Truman's. He came here anyway, paid his respects, went back to Texas, died about 3 weeks later. And Lady Bird once told me that she thought that one reason why the death came when it did was he was so upset by the experience of coming here to pay homage to his own old friend. In any case, to move on to more current, more serious subject.
Before you do, may I say what you reminded me of something. 1960, I'm traveling with Lyndon Johnson. I'm his young valet on the road.
He was more than a valet, I can tell you.
He was urging me to go into politics down the road, and I said, well, what's the secret of success in politics, Mr. Senator Johnson? And he said, you attend more funerals than the other fellow.
Absolutely. Would you say that's true of the current administration as well, Bill? I think he's not attended one funeral. We've been up to some other things that you've been talking about. I think your question is, does it ever go the other way?
Right.
And I think I'd be a little bit optimistic about that. If we were sitting here in August of 1974, as Tim can tell us since he's the director of the Man's Library, Richard Nixon had violated the Constitution, had authorized the CIA opening mail, abusing the FBI and the IRS, all these things, break-ins, I won't run down the whole list. And I think if we had been here talking about that, we would have been pretty gloomy about the future. But somehow we had a system that was able to bounce back, and it depended on two things: vigorous courts that prosecuted the crimes that were committed by Richard Nixon and the others in the Watergate scandal. And the one that I've thought about actually more frequently in the last couple of years is a Congress which acted. You had a Democratic Congress, and again, contrast that with nowadays. Democratic Congress, which in early 1973 said that there is evidence that this presidency has really gone off the rails, is potentially violating the law in ways that we have never seen before. There was a Senate investigation, House impeachment inquiry. Richard Nixon was on the verge of impeachment at the time he resigned. That might not have been the case if you had not had an opposition Congress that was pushing the investigation and trying to take the power back. And I guess if you want to put it in a current events, or put it in the context of current events, I think for people who may be dissatisfied with some of the things that George Bush has done, you can blame the president who did that, but I think you also have to blame the other branches who perhaps have not been as vigorous as they otherwise should have been. And I, as an historian, I have no views about living people, so I'm just speaking about this but in this case, I mention two examples for those of you who are distressed about certain things about the current administration. One is anyone who's unhappy about the fact that we went to war in Iraq. That resolution faced a majority Democratic Congress in the fall of 2002, and the number of Democratic senators that I know, and I would suspect Bill probably knows, who in public voted for that resolution, and in private were saying, I think it's a terrible resolution, and I'm worried that this will lead to a march to war, but I'm afraid of being castigated as someone who's not patriotic. I'm afraid it's going to hurt me politically in the next election. There were too many Democrats who did not vote what their heart told them, and in some cases have spent the time ever since then, trying to explain that vote. And the other is, Democrats last year, as far as I could see, were elected largely to wind down the war in Iraq. Bill will remember very well, and it's documented in the Nixon Library, how long it took the Congress to wind down the war in Vietnam, long after the war in Vietnam became very unpopular. The first serious moves were really 1970. Cooper Church, McGovern Hatfield, Congress tried to cut the funding. President Nixon said, don't vote for these bills. If you vote for them, you're a traitor, you're undercutting our men in the field. People were very much affected by that, and those bills did not pass. The American involvement in that war tragically went on for 3 more years. So I guess what I would say is that, if you're unhappy about a president who takes too much power, you have to also look at those who've allowed him to do it.
Before we go on to Elizabeth and Tim, let me ask you a couple of questions based on what you said. You remind me that last evening on our broadcast, we featured a short essay on the fact that it was the 21st of October, 40 years ago, that the huge March on Washington took place. 50,000 people moved from the Lincoln Memorial over to the Pentagon, and the dissent about the war turned into resistance against the war. The famous photograph that we used on our broadcast last night, and by the way, for those of you who are not tuned in, Bill Moyers' Journal appears here in Kansas City every Friday evening, and I'm referring to that. And
I suggest watch it live, then watch it on TiVo once again.
There's this famous photograph of Robert McNamara, then Secretary of Defense, looking down from the Pentagon on this mass of protesters below him. That's where we have the famous photograph also of the young man putting the flower in the bayonet of the soldier, the National Guardsman, and that became a symbol around the world of the war. But a historian named Morris Isserman, who teaches at Hamilton College, was a 16-year-old protester. It was his first visit to Washington on October 21st, 1967, and he has written a marvelous piece last week in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is one of Judith's and my favorite publications, about how 3 months before that protest, McNamara had sent a memo to the Johnson White House expressing grave doubts about the war in Vietnam. And yet, Michael, despite that protest, despite the Secretary of Defense's own doubts, that war continued another 7 years and ended in debate. So my question to you, you make me think this is not so much a constitutional crisis we face as an institutional crisis, that the powers of the government are such that they do not respond to the will of the people.
Or people are not doing what they should. I mean, Democrats in 1970 knew that the public had turned against this war. Many of them had been elected to stop the Vietnam War, yet they allowed themselves to be intimidated by Nixon and others, saying, if you vote for these measures to cut off funding for the war, we will crucify you as traitors and people who are causing Americans who are in South Vietnam, or fighting the Vietnam War, to die. So my point is that, what I would like to see is, if people are against the war, be willing to say it may cost me the next election. Won't like it, but I will feel that was a worthy thing. Historically, in 1940, there were a lot of people who in Congress felt that Franklin Roosevelt was making a terrible mistake by building up our defense in a way that might lead to involvement in a war in Europe, and perhaps against the Imperial Japanese. And they stood up to him. They said, we're isolationist, we think that you're wrong. After Pearl Harbor, those people looked as if they were crazy, and they were not very wise. Many of them were defeated in 1942. My point is that they were willing to have the courage of their convictions and say, this is what I believe, this is what I was elected for, and if the public feels that I was wrong, I'm just going to have to go back home. I don't think we see enough of that nowadays.
Let me move on to get the perspective of Elizabeth Spaulding, who, as Michael said, and Michael Devine said, and I reiterated, wrote her book on the first Cold War president, Harry Truman. And today at the library, I noticed a letter from Lyndon Johnson to Harry Truman in 1968. Johnson is in his last year of his presidency, and he writes Harry Truman one of many, many letters, but he compares Harry Truman's stand against armed terrorism in Greece to what he is doing against armed terrorists in South Vietnam. I had not realized at the time. I had left the Johnson administration by then, but I did not realize that LBJ was reaching out to Harry Truman to link to terrorism in Greece and Vietnam in the same way that George Bush now links everything to terrorism. So Elizabeth comes with her own frame for this discussion, but when you're finished, I'm going to ask you to what extent has terrorism reframed this whole issue of presidential power?
Thank you, Bill. I just have to start by saying that I have a special place in my heart for the Truman Library. It's been mentioned, but I just want to say formally a thank you. I've benefited directly from researching at the Truman Library and from the generous funding of the Truman Library Institute. Indeed, my very first exposure to archival research was when I was a high school student, and it was actually at the Truman Library. So I've been wild about Harry for a long time. It is not surprising that we're sitting here talking about presidential power, and I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about how the questions about presidential power are most acute in wartime. And that's what makes Harry Truman, who was a strong president in wartime, compelling. And so I really do want to frame these beginning remarks in the context of Truman and talk about it that way. So everyone will recall that President Truman made the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. And he also made some unpopular decisions with respect to a series of labor strikes and the seizure of the steel mills at different points in his presidency. But if we are looking for lessons for today, then we must consider Truman's assertion of presidential power in order to put forth the United States as the leading power in the Cold War. And that's the way in which I'm talking about this. His presidency was a watershed in American foreign policy, and nearly everyone now praises him in hindsight. Nearly everyone praises him now for it. And it's precisely because of his presidential leadership. Truman was president after two very strong Democratic Party models of expansive presidential power, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt. And as we've been talking about here, Truman knew FDR personally, so he, of course, had his personal opinions too. But he admired these two men, and he looked at them as examples. But he also held up George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson as superior models. And we might call all of these men precedent setters in presidential power, using power according to the circumstances of their time. And Truman certainly followed their lead. The extraordinary nature of the Cold War prompted Truman to exercise presidential power in a sharper and often more assertive way. And first, Truman did this rhetorically and morally. For him, the Cold War was a conflict between good and evil, between freedom and tyranny, between liberal democracy and totalitarianism, between capitalism and communism. And he used black and white language. We can't get around it. He, at certain points in his presidency, he even advocated what he called a campaign of truth. This had political and rhetorical elements to it, but Truman deemed it imperative that the world's major religions would actually band together in a faith-based initiative to go after atheistic communism. It was the way in which he thought ultimately the Cold War would be won, that you couldn't get away from the moral grounding of it. Second, Truman wielded presidential power in a combination of political, economic, and military programs and policies. And taken as a whole, we refer to this as Truman's strategy of containment. And it was revolutionary. It committed the United States in world affairs in a way it had never been before. It was unprecedented. Think of just the main programs and policies: the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, NATO, the expansion of the Voice of America, the establishment of Radio Free America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty, the decision to move forward with the hydrogen bomb, NSC 68, the police action that was called the Korean War. All of these things are just the highlights of containment. And Truman was helped in implementing containment by both Republican and Democratic Congresses, but throughout he was the driving force. And third, Truman used presidential power in order to transform the national security structure of the United States. And here his keen administrative eye was at work. He wanted a Department of Defense, for he had seen the inefficiencies and the infighting among the separated services. He wanted a CIA in order to keep the president and the rest of the government fully informed. And he saw the need for a National Security Council. Although here he also showed his understanding of checks and balances and separation of powers, because he thought that Congress was aiming to infringe on his authority in the National Security Act of 1947. So he did sign the act after it passed Congress, and then he proceeded to structure and use the National Security Council so that it served rather than contained the president in foreign policy. I think throughout all of this, it's important to remember that Truman was not formally educated. He was the last president not to have a college education. He was very much a man of the 20th century, but he was also a man at home with the past. And as much as he esteemed Jefferson, Jackson, and other great Democrats, he would talk about the characters of great statesmen. He would talk about the characters, especially, of George Washington and of Cincinnatus. And I think this needs to be underscored. And that to grasp his understanding of presidential power is to understand his self-education, his take on history, and his life experiences, and everything from World War I to the U.S. Senate. And that in order to really understand his view of presidential power, we have to comprehend his statesmanship. And these questions about presidential power are perennial. They go back to our founding, and they are having to do with the necessities of executive power in the context of constitutional government. And now, as we've been talking about and beginning to talk about here and debate, we have a sitting president in an ongoing war. And it is very difficult in real time to make a final assessment. We don't have the perspective and proportion that history will give us. So I don't have a crystal ball, and I look forward to hearing what Tim has to add to this. But I would, and I don't know if I can answer definitively all questions, but what I would say is that it would not surprise me if history vindicates, in part at least, the current president, just as it has Harry Truman, who left office with a lower approval rating. I know it's hard to believe we can go lower, but he did, and was scorned by many for what he had done in trying to lead his nation in a fight against a totalitarian enemy. So, thanks.
Michael and I were talking before, thank you very much, about about the unexplained bond that ran between LBJ and Harry Truman. And one of my speculations is because as Johnson was ending his term in office, he too was greatly disparaged, savaged, very low in the polls, but had watched Harry Truman be resurrected. The resurrection of Harry Truman's reputation didn't reach fruition until the mid-'70s. But by the late 60s, there was a new appreciation. And I think LBJ identified, in a way, with the fact that, as Elizabeth just said, Harry Truman had been disparaged for a lot of this.
He was hoping.
He was hoping. But Elizabeth, I'm so glad you pointed out that it is possible to bend history to fit our partisan lens, but it distorts history when we do. Because the fact of the matter is, Democrats have been engaged in this to and froing of power for a long time. You talked about Harry Truman being formally uneducated, but he was very well read. The most formally educated president in American history, the only PhD ever to reach the White House, former president of Princeton University, was Woodrow Wilson. And it was Woodrow Wilson who authorized his Attorney General Palmer to conduct what became the notorious Palmer raids, which was a ferocious breakdown, the crackdown, the first one truly in American history, the first true crackdown on radicals in America came under the Wilson administration and Palmer. And it was Woodrow Wilson, through Palmer, who put into office, a 24-year-old G-man named J. Edgar Hoover, who then ran the longest course of tenure in any American governmental institution, and who, under two other Democratic presidents many years later, Kennedy and Johnson, carried on his wiretapping of Martin Luther King. So we deceive ourselves if we think our partisan champions are likely to be purer than snow when it comes to the abuses of presidential power. Which brings us to somebody not so pure as snow as Richard Nixon, and
He's not talking about you, Tim.
No, it's not you,
and
Tim.
I do not mean any guilt by association with Tim Natali, because
That would be wrong.
That would be wrong, because Judith and I met Tim for the first time at a marvelous retreat of historians and some survivors of the administrations off the coast of Georgia a few years ago. Tim was then at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia and had done a magnificent job of organizing and deciphering many of the telephone conversations that are at the LBJ Library during the Kennedy administration, during the Johnson administration and the Kennedy administration. And this conference was devoted to the question, hypothetical question to which there is no answer, true answer, would Kennedy, had he survived, escalated the war in Vietnam as Johnson did? And Judith and I came back impressed with this young scholar who was so devoted to the integrity of history. So that when I read that he had been named president ahead of the Nixon Library, I had to go back and look at my notes to see if this was Tim Natali. It was. And I expect, as I said to you earlier, you're exactly what that Nixon Library needs and will retrieve from the shadows of the Nixon presidency what is vital to learn about presidential power. Tim?
Wow. I can only go down in your estimation now. I have to begin by saying, and it's going to be pretty obvious, what I have to say is not the view of the United States government. We are in a crisis. And I would like to quote a voice more eloquent than my own about that. Although we had fought wars before and our personal freedoms had survived, there had been periods of gross abuse when hysterical fear and hate ran high and minorities were unlawfully and cruelly abused. Every man who cares about freedom must fight for it for the other man with whom he disagrees. This was a statement that was made at the Library of Congress 1 week after Pearl Harbor by Attorney General Francis Biddle. 2 months later, Francis Biddle would acquiesce in the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans, of whom 70,000 were American citizens. So when we talk about abuses, let's make it clear, we're not talking about whether these are good men or not good men. I don't want to engage in that kind of discussion about the current administration, but I'm happy to discuss the question of abuse and why it is that our fine country and fine citizens, on many occasions, respond to fear by abusing civil rights. That is a problem. And there's a reason for it, I'm afraid. And I would like to turn to another more eloquent person who faced a great problem in the 1860s, a rebellion in our fine country. Abraham Lincoln was devoted to civil liberties, but he was also devoted to the Union, to defending the Union. In the first article of our Constitution, there is a reference to the power to revoke the writ of habeas corpus, which is the right of judicial review of any detention. And that writ may be suspended in times of rebellion or invasion. It does not say in our Constitution who may revoke this writ, but the fact that it's in Article 1 of the Constitution, which you know establishes Congress and enumerates congressional powers, one would have assumed that that means only Congress can revoke it. But Abraham Lincoln thought differently. Listen to how he explains why he can do it in 1863. By necessary implication, when rebellion or invasion comes, the decision is to be made from time to time, and I think the man whom for the time the people have, under the Constitution, made the commander-in-chief of their army and navy, is the man who holds the power and bears the responsibility of making it. If he uses the power justly, the same people will probably justify him. If he abuses it, he is in their hands, to be dealt with by all the modes they have reserved to themselves in the Constitution. There was a humility. Even with this stretch of presidential authority, Abraham Lincoln had a sense of the humility of power. The same year, he expressed this humility in a way some of you might find interesting. The same power that he used to detain those supporting the rebellion and those speaking up for the war Democrats, he also used to free the slaves. He made emancipation a sense of military necessity. So in a sense, he expanded his powers to do something we all recognize as morally good, justified and long overdue. But he only liberated the slaves in a certain portion of the Confederacy. He didn't do so in parts of Virginia and in Louisiana. And Salmon P. Chase said to him, you ought to do it. You have this opportunity to free more slaves. Why don't you do it? And here is where you see greatness. Though we would all have wanted him to do that, and ultimately it would happen with Congress and the congressional and an amendment to our Constitution, Lincoln said the following. He said, I can't do it. He said, the emancipation of the slaves has no constitutional or legal justification except as a military measure. I conceive that I may in an emergency do things on military grounds which cannot constitutionally be done by Congress. As Commander-in-Chief, I suppose I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy. But if I take the step, must I do so without the argument of military necessity, which he felt he could not sustain for Louisiana? And so without any argument, except the one that I think the measure politically expedient and morally right, would I thus not be in the boundless field of absolutism? That's a great phrase. Remember that, the boundless field of absolutism. Could this, he said, pass unnoticed or unresisted? So even in making the argument of military necessity, Lincoln recognized there were limits to his power. And he recognized not just moral and historical limits, but political limits. And he spoke of the boundless field of absolutism, which is what happens when presidents exceed those limits. There is a gray area in our Constitution surrounding the power, and Elizabeth has alluded to this, the power of our Commander-in-Chief. It is unusual for a leader of a country to be head of state, head of government, and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. This was an 18th century idea that has very powerful and unexpected implications in the 21st century. We've talked about, I've mentioned